I see so many people from the Washington area out there, you don't need to see my face. I see it every Sunday. But there's so many of you that I know that it just, it almost feels like there's a dialogue homily on Sunday morning. Sure.
To make you more visible.
Yeah. Well, let me begin by saying I'm still amazed at how close our presentations are to one another, even though we didn't really rehearse them or find ways to, how computers are, they only work when you don't need them. Come on now, where is slideshow? There it is. Great. You have this, too. You have it in a copy down there, when smaller, you got 6 slides per page. So, the reason I'm giving it to you is that I'm not telling you anything new. If in the context of religious faith, if I'm telling you something new, you be sure it's wrong, because I'm here to remind us. So we come out of a Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition is memory. Remember, remember, remember. And much of this is evoking memory, so that to provide a context to the survey and to what we're doing here today. And much of it's going to be that. So you won't find anything dramatically new on there, except some of the results of the survey that were much better summarized here by Michelle Dillon. But I'm very happy to be with you, and I just want to say that, okay, here we go. But I know many of the Washington people, others I've seen here and there, but I gave a presentation to the Congress in 2001 as well, and that was very simply a comparison and reflection on the history of the religious orders in the church, their present status, their struggles, comparing it to what's happening with many of the intentionally Eucharistic communities. It was I found it a fruitful conversation, and to tell you the truth, halfway through the discussion afterwards, it sounded like one of our own community meetings. Because the person sitting here in the room, but I won't name her, got up and said, well, let me tell you, I was so angry at the church back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and I'm still angry at the church, and my parents used to say to me, get over it, what's going on with you? And she said, now my daughter says that to me. Why do you care? Except her daughter says, why do you care so much? Why do you care so much? Why don't you leave it if it's such a big problem for you? And the same person said, she doesn't know I could never leave the church. I could never leave the church. But I'm angry. But those are the kinds of conversations. We'll come back to that later. It's that conversation, I think, to name Michelle Dillon's terms and the sociological terms, between the Vatican II generation and the post-Vatican II generation. But I'll save that for later. Much of that is the struggle of the religious life. If you see it, diminishment to a large extent is our inability to reach the post-Vatican II generation in many ways with religious vocation. But I serve in many of your communities, and I think you struggle with that too, don't you? And it's a much broader thing, and we'll come back to that later as well. But it is some of the commonalities, besides that prophetic role in the church, which we'll come back to later as well. I was originally asked to give a paper, as they say, on the spirituality of the intentionally Eucharistic communities, but knowing what a rambunctious, assertive lot they are, I thought I would be taking my life in my hands and told you what your spirituality is. And Bill's brilliant studies over the years have been so helpful in other areas. It seemed ideal to take the spirituality of the IECs and put them into the sociological literature, and Michelle Dillon has done that so well today. But the only thing I really can do in a useful way is call us back to the foundational pieces of theological reflection. And theological reflection, we do it every minute of every day. Anytime we advert to God, advert to our faith, we do a bit of theological reflection. It's the search for what our experience means in the context of, call it theology or call it the core elements of Catholic faith. If you're talking about the Catholic Church, which we're basically talking about here, that's all I'm going to try to help to do. But it will light up some of the findings of the survey, and we'll talk more about that later. Michelle Dillon is a top sociologist, as is our own Bill D'Antonio here, and they have to limit themselves to scientific data and the scientific method. But they would be the first to say, too, if you live that way, though, you disenchant the world around you. It's the big struggle of postmodernism. That our wonderful methods of science and often our methods of philosophy are so rigorously certainty-based that you simply disenchant the mystery of the world around us. And we'll that as well. And I got to simply rely on Michelle Dillon's findings. So if they're in the report here, many of them are simply what she put up on the screen already, but here you have them written by way of summary. I'm not going to dwell on them, though, because she can do that better. So credible social science has to use the scientific method. If you live that way, you choke yourself to death. I'm sure Bill will be the first to say that, and Michelle as well. Natural scientists say that as well. Their sciences, not lifestyles. But what is theological reflection? I mean, you might go back to one of the earliest struggles in the Middle Ages. That theology, and I feel very hesitant to see Paul Fulber sitting right smack there on my idea when he's an excellent theologian, and I'm sure he'll fill this out better than I will. But there was a big struggle in the Middle Ages where St. Thomas Aquinas wanted to establish theology as a science that could be heard and understood among the other sciences of the time. And he used Aristotle to do that. It outraged the monastics. The monastics said, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" Theology, as it had been through Augustine and through the whole Middle Ages, has been a loving, contemplative reflection on the mysteries of Christian belief. To systematize them, to organize them. And St. Thomas himself was a contemplative. It's clear he was. You can't read his theology without knowing that he was a contemplative. But he had a specific purpose. He wanted to establish the viability of his theological thinking in the world. But he would never have lived out of that scientific theology. He lived out of a contemplation on the mysteries of faith. And that's what I'm meaning by a theological reflection here. It interprets the data through the eyes of faith and unfold its meanings for life. That's what theology does for us. It's become very astute and high class and academic, and some people think we are back to that problem in the Middle Ages. There are many people think that the academy, the university system, has torn theology out of a theological, a contemplative reflection on the wonders of faith, and has turned it into a science, and that's why we don't hear much about it. And that's why it's so little part of our lives, just for another conversation. The methods do not need to be in conflict. The Catholic Church, in many of its errors over the history, back to Galileo, etc., firmly in the last century came to the point there is no conflict between faith and science. There simply isn't one. We heard it from John Paul II when he said, evolution seems to be a natural part of the reality of the world around us. And so there's no conflict between these two, as long as they dialogue with humility, and that's what doesn't happen. Theologians think they know too much. Scientists think they know too much and simply write each other off. One of my first impressions, and they probably wouldn't be a lot different from the way they were in 2001 about the spirituality of the intentionally Eucharistic communities. I firmly believe that the intentionally Eucharistic communities are a form of ecclesial lay movement in the contemporary church, but they're not recognized. You're not the Legionnaires. You're not Opus Dei. You're not Focolare. I have a lot of regard for, frankly. It's called the Word of Mary, and it's involved in the dialogue over the hope of the world in many ways. But I do think the intentionally Eucharistic communities function like a lay ecclesial movement. But also, I think they're picking up the role of the celibate religious orders in history, and I'll come back to that later. Doesn't mean that religious orders are going out of existence. If you look at the history of religious life, the mendicants didn't do away with the monastics. They took it somewhere else. The apostolics and Jesuits didn't do away with the mendicants. They took it in a different direction. We'll come back to that later. You have taken the prophetic charism of the history of religious life, which what Avery Dulles said many years ago, before he became the man we knew late in his life, that there is a prophetic succession in the church. It's not a guaranteed one, but there's a succession in the church, just like there's a hierarchical succession of bishops. And the religious will often associate with that. I think the intention of the Eucharistic communities have picked up that role. Because celibacy is an issue. Have you noticed there's an issue in the church? These communities, Virginia put it so well from her own experience, but it's my experience too. And I could tell you many of the stories of the Washington communities. They're products of stories. And that's pretty much what they are. If you try to regiment an understanding of them, you'll lose the concreteness of those stories and lose who they are. I can tell you every single one of them. Two of them were ejected and exiled from parishes that they had moved beyond. One fairly violently, another in Gradually, it had become a reform movement of a parish that finally left that parish. Another Eucharistic community was simply thrown out of a university setting where they had celebrated for years as a community. Another community had, another one's been around since the 1960s. When I studied here in the 1960s, they were the community that picked up the liturgical reforms, took what we call the folk mass back in those days. In the 1960s, there was a day when we called it that. It was seen as a reform movement. Traveled all over Washington, not to put on a show, but to help parishes get a sense of how liturgy could change. And they were thrown out of the archdiocese somewhere in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I was astonished to find that they're still celebrating over in Virginia after 40 years. But these stories are critical. They tell them over and over again, and they energize them. There are key icons and figures in the foundations of those communities who are living and sometimes not living now that are iconic, and that to try to render that social science can be a problem. There's often a prophetic cast related to the story. Prophetic identity. Actually, I was at a Pax community there. You come out during the week and prepare a homily together with the group. I find it very useful and meaningful. But that night we got into some of this, the nature of that community. And it's similar to all of them now. Almost all of the members of the intentional Eucharistic communities are reactive to the anonymity of the modern parish. They simply can no longer go sit in a parish church of 300 people and listen to a homily and have a query anonymous Eucharist and say that they have gone to church on Sunday. So in fact, they go to funerals and weddings around town, and they always come back with very interesting stories. As a matter of fact, I know in one diocese where there's a lot of strength in not going to communion unless you're Catholic, and it's announced from the pulpit, don't come up here if you're not Catholic. They do not go to communion because they don't believe they can participate in the Eucharist that does that, but just that reactiveness. A need for an experienced sense of prayer and worship, that it isn't good enough to have ex opere operato valid Eucharist. It just isn't enough. And they have to have an experience of prayer and worship, often in a dialogue home or homily setting, or in some form where they have experienced one another. Size has an effect on that. They thirst for a shared communal sense of spirituality as an overarching meaning. As a group of Catholics, the old question, why don't you just leave the church if you've got this big problem with it? They can never leave the church. And by the time we get to the end of this, I hope you'll see why they are the church, as Michelle said so articulately. And there's conflict in those communities. If there wasn't, you'd be really, I think you're pretty sick, wouldn't you? I mean, are diverse, are different, assertive people. Some of the issues over women's language that's patriarchal in women, whether we should allow, or whether we should have Eucharist when ordained ministers aren't present, etc., etc., etc. Those are conflicts everywhere. They are all negotiated in dialogue, and this is a never-ending process. And I know some communities have worked very deliberately on the issues of dialogue because there's no authority figure to resolve them. If you were in the institutional church, as we call it, somebody would resolve this for you. I'm going to go back one now. Here we go. My first impressions is that fierce loyalty to Catholic identity. Oh, come on. None of you would leave the church. I don't think you would. If you were going to do it, you would have done it a long time ago, wouldn't you? And that there's a loyalty to the church. A problem with the institution. We'll come back to that. A real desire to stay in dynamic touch with the broader church. I know it sometimes is spoken hurtfully and sometimes a little anger, but at the end of the day, we don't want to lose touch with the universal church stuff. And there's ways that happens as a struggle to do it when you feel alienated, and often it comes out in the issue of whether you need an ordained minister to do Eucharist on Sunday. Some say, well, that's the way we stay connected with the universal church. And I'm not going to get into that issue, though. They've often been wounded as a group by a blatant act of authoritarianism. I can't think of a single community that hasn't been. And it's a constant reminder to the broader church of the severe struggles of our time. Michelle said that in so many different ways. I mentioned much of this already. Yes. going backwards. No wonder I'm so familiar. Three core elements. All of the communities that I celebrate in, I think, would agree that I'm very strong on preaching the liturgical year. There's an Advent Christmas mystery, it's the Incarnation. There's a Lent Easter season that is the resurrection, Paschal mystery. And there is a Pentecost season that is life from the Spirit in the ordinary times of life. Those are the three great mysteries. The one thing that's often missing in our dialogues, and I think it's certainly missing in the sociological literature, is the Catholic imagination. There's no doubt that it exists. Really is written extensively on it. Dolby Antonio would say it's definitely there. Where does it come from? I think it comes from worship. I think catechetics here and there, religion classes here and there, but I think it comes out of worship. And it is these three great mysteries of the liturgical year. So when I talk about Catholic identity, I want to use those three great mysteries to light up the language and bring it into the language of faith as we talk about the very issues raised in the survey and with Michelle Dillon. Incarnation. This is mystery. I've told the story in the communities, but the other ones might not hear it. You heard this story or joke about the evangelical minister and the Catholic priest and the Orthodox priest, and they're talking about mystery. And the evangelical fundamentalists said bunk. Mystery is bunk. It's a way of confusing the scriptures. Pick up the scriptures, understand them. You don't need mystery. There are no mysteries. It's here in the scriptures. Just pick them up. Literal interpretation, understand them. And the priest is looking and describing them. No. It's all mystery. Everything is mystery. We never fully understand anything about the Incarnation, about the Paschal mystery, about God, about the creation of the Holy Spirit. You have about 20 minutes and I'll tell you all about it. That's what the Catholic priest says. And then the Orthodox priest says, oh my God, no, we dwell in mystery. We live in mystery. The whole Eastern Christianity is a creature of mystery. We have symbols, we celebrate them, but the issue of mystery is critical for our misunderstanding. We're too Western, we're too literal-minded, we're too illiterate in the area of symbol. So one core thing for our discussion is it filters throughout the whole survey, and it filters throughout much of what Michelle Dillon says. Incarnation. Karl Rahner says that the issue of the mystery of the Incarnation is not calling Christ God. It's calling the human divine. That's the real mystery. And but to find out in this divine mixing without confusion that humanity, as the fathers of the church said, their spirituality is divinized. Or is Revelation telling you 24 new things, or is it an unveiling? It's an unveiling of a mystery that we are all divine at our core. And that our unfolding life process moves us back to the divinity from whom we come. As Karl Rahner also says, it's very interesting to say Christ was God, but really, do you care? It's very interesting to know that we're divine, and that's the only way we could understand the Christian mystery of the Incarnation. God could become human, it's possible, and a human could become God, so we are interlocked with divinity. The line of Genesis that we are made in the image of God is absolutely literal in many ways. It has all kinds of consequences. It is embodied. It is impossible to imagine a Christianity that's not embodied. A spirituality that doesn't happen in the body. We are redeemed and revealed in our body. It should be the theology of all sexuality and human life. That experiential, embodied sense of spirituality that Michelle talked about that's impossible to capture is part of that. The intricate and subtle communication of the divine and human is the history of our spiritual lives, if you want to call that. And the history of salvation is bodily, historically, worldly. History that was extreme importance to us. In Buddhist-Christian dialogue, the Buddhists say, you Christians are too involved in the world. It's Maya. It's really illusion. Why do you get so hung up in it? We turn back to them and say, that's the only place we know grace. It happens in history. It happens in history. It is profoundly important to us. Think of your approach to social issues. Revelation, remember, if you look at Avery Dulles, I used Avery Dulles only in this presentation because he's better known than many other people. Avery Dulles' book on the models of the church is very interesting. I asked him very late in his life what he thought was his greatest book. He said, "Read, there's only one book that I wrote. It was new." And I spent most of my life writing it as models of Revelation. The way we understand of Revelation is he thinks it's a critical issue of the era. At the end of the day, Revelation comes through symbols that are always ambiguous and mysterious, and they unveil the illusions of our lives. Revelation is about unveiling, if you look at the original meaning of the word. And this mystery of the Incarnation unveils for us. I know Paul can catch me on this because he's a Thomist, but to my understanding, Thomas says that baptism, it's a supernatural mark. He had all that wonderful language, but he said at the end of the day, it breaks open and reveals what the person already was. When we raise up that child in baptism, we say, look at this poor piece of divinity born among us. That's what we do. Paschal mystery. We're done with the incarnation period, the lights of Advent, the new revelation, tearing away everything we thought we knew, moving through the period of Epiphany, manifestation, and into the Paschal mystery. There is a tragic element to Catholicism. Catholic faith said, when the innocence of God came among us, in Jesus Christ, the religious and civil systems of the day crucified and killed him because he was too much for us. And the crowds were cheering in violence. That's shocking stuff. Many of you have looked at Rene Girard and some of the ways of understanding stuff today. Nobody could ever be too optimistic about our religious or civil system with that kind of a background behind us. He talked about your distrust of governments, etc., etc., etc. But that's who we are. We are not naive optimists. Whether we struggle over a doctrine of religion and sin, we certainly struggle over the horrible violence and evil that the world around us is capable of. And yet, resurrection. I've moved on to the Trinity already. The Trinity, at its core, we can argue, it's been so misstated so often throughout the history of our catechetics and theology, but it's been broken open by many recent writers. At the end of the day, it is this, that all that we call the world around us, ourselves and all creation, is a gift coming forth from God and God's love. And it is an emanation of God coming out of God. It has no other identity. Don't get hung up on black holes, alternate universes, quantum mechanics, Newtonian physics. Those are very good scientific. For us, we know where the world comes from. It is an act of love coming out of God, especially as you look at Colossians and Ephesians. And it is sustained in being in every second of his existence by the gift of God. We dwell in mystery. We dwell in the love of God. And we have to have our illusions torn away about this. And finally, we're only going in one direction, back to the God who sent us off. That's what the Trinity is really all about. So, incarnation, paschal mystery, Trinity, pretty good basis to build a Catholic faith, isn't it? That's where identity comes from. Let's look back at some of the findings. I'm going to move quickly through this because Michelle has already done it. Autonomy of individuals within religious institutions. Let me skip on here to one more thing, because I want to get to no, let me put this the other way. Sorry, I want to. This time is going on, I don't want to use too much more. Because this is in your paper, and we can use it. What is this church we keep talking about? Michelle put it very well. If we get hung up on its institutional nature, we lose focus of what it really is. The church is the new creation that springs forth in God's grace, revealed to us in the power of Jesus Christ and the Spirit, that there had always been a new creation among us. Dwelling in that new creation is the church. And as St. Augustine put it so well, many who think they're in it are going to find out they were out of it, and many who thought they were out of it are going to find out they were in it at the end of time. That church is the one in which we dwell. And I remember doing a workshop for, I think, the Nova community a few years ago on people's alienation from the church. Where would you go if you left the church? Do you walk out of creation? Do you walk out of the mystery of God among us? Do you walk out? That's the church. That's the real big church. The big church is not the institution. It's only one. It's a way of organizing the church to the imperfections of history. And it is in crisis in the Western world. If you have a little time at the end, I'll say some way. But if we get hung up on that, we forget that we are the church, and the church is bigger than we are, and it's cross-religious, it's inter-religious. The Spirit often doesn't need us to bring about salvation. What did St. Paul II himself say? That the Spirit is alive and at work in the other world's religions. He blew the mind out of Ratzinger and Foundation of the Doctrine of Faith, but he actually said it. He did say it. The church really is the herald and proclaimer of that vision that I mentioned earlier. It is the servant for the world and the vision of Jesus of that vision of the world. It is the mystical communion in the Spirit of that vision. It is the sacrament, according to Vatican II, the efficacious sign of the ardent longings of the human heart for that vision I mentioned earlier. And by the way, you know what? We need an institution to organize it. Do we want to get hung up on that? That institution is dying in the Western world. I think it was Tom Roberts or John Allen that said 4 or 5 years ago, you can't run this world church on 1,500 bureaucrats in Rome. It's spinning out of control. It's not going to last in the way we have organized it. Rahner said at the end of his life, I thought that Vatican II was the first council of the emerging world church. He said, I realize now at the end of my life it was the last council of the European church. There's changes coming for this church that define anything that we're thinking about. That just, okay? Just get back to just about this religiousness and religious orders. There are 4 great epics in the church. There's a new book out, as a matter of fact, Tom Roberts has a review of it in the current NCR, I think. The Great Emergence, the 4 great epics of the church history. You can parallel the religious. We've been through massive change with regard to everything the IECs are talking about the church. And about the year 500, when the great conversions of what was then the pagans in the world, of the Roman Empire, and about the year 1000 when the great reforms of the religious orders emerged, and about the year 1500 when the Reformation happened, and we're going through another one now. Our changes are well beyond anything that we're angry about. We're angry at the church. It's religion that's dying under us in the Western world. In any way that we've seen it, Philip Jenkins, the next Christendom, says that it's very unlikely that the future of Christianity will look like anything that we've been looking at today. Phyllis Tickle on the Great Emergence. Charles Taylor's new books. Don't even think of reading The Secular Age or any of his other great works. It's 2 simple little books. Ethics of Authenticity, Varieties of Religious Experience. You'll see the changes we're contemplating are way beyond anything that we're dealing with. I think that I will probably leave it there. We can get over-focused on the institution of the Catholic Church. I think we can leave the institution, but we can never leave the church. Our basic vision as Christians leads us to the trust of the presence of the Spirit, dwelling in a church of a new creation that's beyond all of us. It is the new creation. That's why. And finally, it is fidelity of the Spirit that will lead us there. The rest I'll leave to you for discussion and response. Thank you.